that was a lot that we just went to meet. We've been trying in our new podcast booth here for about an hour to get going. I think we're finally ready to go.
A lot of mic checking. We did a lot of mic checking.
Yeah, so thank you for your patience on all that. I love our brand new space. We got some better audio this time around. So let's get into this. So today we want to talk about Indigenous Psychological Services. We want to talk about the growth that you've seen in the last 3 years.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this opportunity to talk about this. But IPS is 3 years old, and we have 33 providers. We really didn't start out with just wanting to be so big so fast. But what happened is there's these two levels that happen. It was like all of these clients are looking for these kind of services, and then providers or psychologists and counselors really gravitated towards us because they like the approach that we're doing. So it just kind of like went, like a little bomb, and it went and it went off.
So why do people really like IPS? Like, why are they coming to you?
People are wanting it, like an Indigenous psychologist, Indigenous services, Indigenous counseling. There's been a lot of conversations when we ask people, like, what are you looking for? How can we help you? And a lot of feedback that we're getting from the people that we're serving and working with is that they want to not have to explain what a residential school is. There's a lot of explaining that. So there, we'll just bookmark why that is right now. And they also, talking about how they have to inform providers about the culture. They have to, they're using this session to, like, this is a medicine wheel. This is why it's important. And so sometimes what we're doing in session, right when people are coming in, is we're doing a lot of like unlearning, or really helping that experience that they had, which was sometimes very negative, very emotionally charging. Because if you come in and you don't feel seen and heard, or you have to explain and educate, then it becomes about the provider. It doesn't become about the client that's coming in for services. So there's been a lot of like people coming in and voicing, I think it's harm being created, and I could be wrong, but when a client is coming in, they are looking for somebody that they don't have to explain that. They don't have to educate. They could get to work. These people are doing some heavy lifting and heavy working right now that they don't want to have to explain to their practitioner what it means to be Indigenous.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting point, that you have to, it becomes a session for the provider. So obviously at IPS, you have non-Indigenous practitioners as well.
Yeah.
But you make sure that they have all that education before they even get into a session.
Yeah, so we do a lot of training and education because there's two parts. Honoring the two-eyed, I talk about it quite a bit by Albert Marshall. The two-eyed seeing is that we need to understand the intergenerational trauma, the blood trauma, the genocide trauma, the colonial trauma, historical, relational. These are all complex, convoluted issues, and so we need a lot of training for that. And then also there's this piece about culture is healing. So even though we have intergenerational trauma, there's called this intergenerational healing. Land heals, culture can heal, ceremony heals, and then we need to really understand the science behind that and explain that to the client. That, sometimes that when we smudge, the brain changes, and here's how we know that it works. And people really do gravitate to the science. Like, it's like, we knew that this has been helpful and supportive through years. But because of the Western approaches and Western psychology, when people coming in to see a psychologist, they do want to hear the science behind it.
That's really, I love when you talk about the science behind it, because it's fascinating. I'm wondering too, as Indigenous Psychological Services goes across Canada, obviously, there's different nations across the country with different needs, with different perspectives, different values. How do you make sure that you're able to have the right provider for a person who's, a Mohawk or someone who's in like Nova Scotia?
Right. I think you're saying a really good point, because when I'm a Woodlands Cree, I'm a Nihio Swan River First Nation. My teachings and knowledge is very different across Canada, like even across Alberta, even within Slave Lake area, right? It's very different. So one of the things is cultural humility, is that I just don't know. I will never go into a situation or a nation and say that just because I'm Indigenous I know. It just doesn't, that's not honoring the cultural approach or circle approach. So we allow, when we go into those nations, that we have to be very relational and humble to them, and what they speak, what they want, with their values, and we really want to learn. It's about them and speaking that language to what they need. And so we can't come in and think that we have this all knowing and I know what's best. Again, that's kind of like a Western approach. Because I'm a psychologist, I should know how to treat you, how to support you. We just step away from that way of being, and that we're really here alongside you, and we're really willing to learn. And so sometimes what I'd like to do is I'd like to do research about that community, the historical impacts of what they went through. Like in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, they have a very different experience than what happened in Alberta and even in BC, right? It's just this huge, vast land and territory. But I like to do the research of what happened in that community, especially the Inuit community as well. And so when I figure out the history, there's also a lot of stuff in the history that's not even said, right?
Right, yeah.
From the Indigenous people. So it's like we have to go to the people. We need to talk to those elders. We need to put some tobacco there, and please teach us about your history and what is it that supports you.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a lot of work for you.
Yeah, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's
Yeah.
exactly it, right? And it's like talking about, I like cultural humility. I like that. You can't just, and it kind of goes back to what you're saying about if providers aren't educated and taught in, like, I'm surprised me that people don't know what residential schools, but to have to say and to be somebody who has whether in generational trauma and to go into a room and say, okay, this is everything, and I'm going to have to educate you on these terrible things. That's wild.
It's so hurtful.
Yeah.
I think it's really hurtful. And when I was creating Indigenous Psychological Services, and I put out job postings, because at the very beginning we had about 1,300 people a month trying to get in, like a month, and I was like, some of us would just with heavy hearts would break down because we couldn't help these people. And how do you say when somebody's reaching out, I'm suicidal, or I need support, I'm not going to hurt myself, but I feel like my life is so awful that, hey, I'm sorry, because of FNIB we can't support you, or hey, like, we have a wait list, and there was a time where we had a 2-year wait list, and it just showed, like, with all of these numbers, that this is a demand. People want this kind of service. They want somebody who focuses on Indigenous healing, Indigenous practices, understanding that. So stepping away from this Western approach to more two-wide or more Indigenous approach, and people that want to hear the stories, that are very passionate about it. So when I opened up IPS, and knowing that I had all this demand and just really tugging at my heart, it was really difficult, and trying to trust the process. I put an ad out, and you know who I would get to come to those ads?
Who? I have no idea.
Yeah, it was actually people from Hong Kong, Japan.
To come and work?
Yeah, Filipino, the Philippines. I even had somebody who was in Nigeria. And so in our CAP, College of Alberta Psychology Association, they could approve those as providers, even though they're not living in Canada. I don't know how they did this, because when I, interviewed them, I'm like, are you sure? Like, you're registered here in Alberta? And they were either like moving to Alberta or having a location in Alberta, but they also would travel quite a bit. They could actually be on the FNIB list, so the First Nations Inuit Health Branch list, more so than somebody who's actually from Alberta or from Canada. They could get on that list much easier than some of people like me.
That's bizarre. Why?
Well, I think it's because they have a doctorate.
Okay.
and they could follow the regulations and guidelines to practice in certain parts of Canada. So they would be always. I would have about 15. Every time I put out a job posting, they would have about 15 people from all over the world, and some of them had a difficulty speaking the language, wanting to work for us. And it was like, it was really difficult because I really wanted somebody with the knowledge and from passionate about working with Indigenous people, if they were in the culture in some way, wanting to learn. And so going back to, I like to ramble, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
And so when I hire somebody on, the very first thing is, are you willing to take the training that we put you through? So you either have to have like an EMDR, somatic, my training. So I put providers through trainings all throughout our agency throughout the year. So at least 4 times a year, they're taking an awareness training, they're taking we have a somatic wheel training, we have like Indigenous ethics training, we do a ton of training. I probably throw it at them a little too much, but they eat it up because this is what it is. Like, you have to have ongoing commitment of training all the time. Research always changes.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know, like, that you have all this training for, anybody of their background, right? So that they can have an understanding of where their Indigenous clients are coming from. That seems very important. I'm wondering, like, you talked about providers from across the world, which is really cool, like, in a sense that, people wanted to come in and work from that lens. But what about, like, Indigenous providers? Like, is there do you have a lot of Indigenous providers? Is there any issues or barriers for Indigenous providers?
I think that's such a great question. Now, the danger of going back to those providers that are across the world, they don't know what a residential school is. So that's kind of the issue, is that none of them actually have to take any training to understand the historical impacts or how to work with that trauma. And so that's why there's like this ethical piece and harm that's being created. It's really difficult to find Indigenous psychologists and clinical social workers. I think clinical social workers have a very grueling process, and I'm not a social worker, but I'm sure that if you kind of ask around, once they go to school, they have to do their clinical supervision, and then they have to wait 2 years after to become a FINIP provider. So that poor clinical social worker has to possibly wait 3 years to get on the FINIP list. It's really difficult. Now, I'm only going to speak from my experience of why I think it's difficult to get into the field of Indigenous psychologist, is because there's, number one, I had a lot of barriers. I was a single parent. It's the funding to go to school, and taking a master's program, it's like costly. It was like $15,000 to $30,000 a year. You need to have coverage. You need to have
money.
Sponsoring, right? So you need to work. But just again, this is my experience: is that if I didn't have the support of my nation to help me cover that, as an Indigenous person, I don't think I could have finished it. I definitely received a lot of scholarships, but I was a single parent, so already there were so many barriers for me. And also, I'm from up north. I had to move to a larger center. People have to leave their community to go to a larger center if they want to do a master's program. So I think there's that. Stomach is growling. I'm so sorry.
Just about lunchtime.
Yeah. And then there's this other piece, is that it was really difficult to be the only Indigenous person in my master's program. There was many times that I really wanted to quit. This was, again, about 15 years ago, of me saying, hey, I've never went into and learned about the culture, and it's really saving my life. Let me talk about it. Let me go into it. I have this vision. And it wasn't warmed and welcomed. It was kind of like, I got, different kind of looks, and it just seemed like it wasn't a very inclusive, welcoming time. But it wasn't like my fellow peers. I think it was just the time in general. It was just that kind of the time of, in that time mark, or however you want to say that. And so when you go into a master's program and you're the only Indigenous person, you really do feel it. You feel it.
Yeah. I imagine you kind of have a whole different yeah, I can only because I'm trying to think of like times when I've been in. I just want to try and please some type of way of empathizing that point. Like I know like I'm in the majority, so most times I don't feel like that, but I can imagine how isolating it would feel.
Yeah, it was very very isolating, and thank goodness, I think Creator really puts people in front of you, right? And it's when I became very passionate, very overtly passionate about it. It was all that came out of my mouth. The people that really wanted to hear it are with me today, and actually are some of our providers. Like they just stood beside me and were rooting me on. And Brittany Travis and Adrienne Henderson were the two people in my program that were like, you need to do this, like tell me more, what's this like, instead of being shunned in some way, they were very embracing and just welcoming. But so after you do the master's program and then you graduate, you go into like a supervision for 1,600 hours, and then you have to do the exam. And so to find a supervisor that specializes with Indigenous counseling, again, is really, really difficult. Thank goodness I was at a treatment center, Nightwind Treatment Center, and the focus was Indigenous healing and with at-risk youth, and it was my best experience of learning, like everything. Again, just soaking up the knowledge that the elders that were there. And so now when you find that supervisor, you actually have to pass this exam. You have 3 tries to pass an exam, and it took me like 4 times because I have a learning disability. That exam and that process of the registration, I think, can be a barrier because you only have 3 tries to pass the hardest exam, like on Turtle Island. It's really difficult, and or you have to start all over
And
again.
This is the EPPP, right?
This is the EPPP.
I remember Lisa, my wife, talking about taking it, and she said like she sat down to write it, and she's like, "Oh my God, I haven't studied for this," but she had studied like 6 weeks every single day for like 5 hours. So when you're saying it's like the hardest exam, I hear that because that's my wife's experience. Was like, as soon as she sat down, she's like, "What am I doing?"
I think there needs to be a trauma group for EPPP or a support group, because it definitely brought in a lot of test anxiety. So now I think that it's going to be harder for our psychologists, Indigenous psychologists coming into the field. And if they have the support, if they don't have the financial barriers, and if they have good connections into the community, I think they're going to be okay. But you need the support, right? You just absolutely need the support. And so also coming into the field, I hid. I didn't want people to know that I'm an Indigenous psychologist with an Indigenous focus. I kind of hid a little, and the reason why is I didn't want to be accused of not being Indigenous enough. I didn't want people to look at me for my passion and think, and then I felt so guilty about it. I felt, should I be doing this? I grew up settler approach, even though I'm Swan River First Nation. Is this my right as an Indigenous person? So I had to go through a journey of really my own healing journey of what it meant to be Indigenous. Like now I can proudly say, like, I'm a Nihiawisqueo. I really take this, and this is my heart, this is how I walk. But many of us hide, for I believe, again, through my journey, for the reason of we don't want to be put on mark on, or we don't know if it's Indigenous enough, or we don't want to be accused of appropriating, or it's a sensitive topic.
Yeah. So what, like, one question I have, like, has this changed the barriers for Indigenous psychologists, or what do you think needs to change?
I think creating a community of us wanting to go in the helping field would be really great. Also, what needs to change is right in the master's program, we're on Turtle Island, we're on this land. How are we actually honoring Indigenous people? And also, like, we know Indigenous people have high suicide rates between 25 and 35. We also know that there's this at-risk behaviors that they really need support of in the time of intervention. Social determinants of health are being broken down. So, for example, if our children are going to school and they don't have the right supports and they can't finish school, they're at risk. If we don't have the access to healthcare, we're at risk. If we have low income, we're at risk. And all of those at risk, right? I mean, I don't like that term, but it means that we could become, at risk in our mental health breaking down, right? So I think that intervention and conversations about residential schools is really important, like proper training, even in the school, but also at the master's programs, to have proper people coming in and presenting about, this has to look very different. Interventions look very different. And then the conversations of people going into the field, mentorship support, case consultations, connecting with community.
Yeah. That's, it's systemic is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
And it needs a lot of breaking down and people in higher positions to really take this lead.
I also think we see it in the BIPOC community,
Mm-hmm.
the refugee and immigration, same kind of issues. Like when we meet with them, it's really cool because we're almost saying like the same thing. And I think that if we stand together instead of stand alone, that I think we could really make a difference of movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then that's a good point, right? People can't be islands.
Yeah.
And we need to be united. So I think taking away from all of that, like, there's a lot that needs to be done. It's great that IPS is able to be a flagship. There for Indigenous providers and non-Indigenous providers who do want to get that education once they become, psychologists or mental health professionals. So that's fantastic. If people want to get in touch with you right now, like, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, they can actually reach out to our website, fill out the form, and our admin.
Yeah, the website, indigenouspsychologicalservices.com.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We're always looking for providers, and we also do a circle approach where I don't own people. We don't own people. Even though I'm the owner and the creator, I don't own people and I don't run it like I'm the boss. We just don't use that language. I believe that people are their own practitioner. They have their own practice. And if they want to come into community and practice together and be willing to learn and willing to experience, because it's about experiencing culture, then we can actually be able to support each other through a circle approach and be able to do a lot more than me saying, I'm your boss. This is how we do things. We just don't do it that way. But as long as people align with the vision of our 7 sacred teachings in Circle, the way we run Circle, relational, and want to work and want to learn and want to experience, then we all come together, and that's why we're growing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if you want to grow with Indigenous Psychological Services, if you're a provider, if you are a mental health professional, go to indigenouspsychologicalservices.com. There's a career section. Get involved.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Lee.